This channel is Meditation Amsterdam. My name is Pablo. Today we get to look at the third video of the book review, The Pearl Beyond Price by A.H. Almaas. One of my top books. And just to quickly recap what we've done in video 1 and 2. In the first video, we made a case for why this book is so fundamental, making a big handshake between psychology and spirituality, and also defining a very effective way to define the ego and a methodology to progressively dismantle it. In the second video, we were talking a little bit more about the notion of how the ego is born in its first stages, and also why the autonomy that we gain when we become identified with the ego is a great achievement, a great psychological achievement in our development as humans. But also we pay a very heavy price in that we gain physical, mental, and emotional autonomy, and yet it undermines our basic autonomy at the level of being. So that the autonomy of the ego, much needed as it is to separate from our mother and in order to become effective in the world, comes at the price of losing basic essential autonomy, which is autonomy at the level of being. In this third video, we go into the next topic as Almaas describes it in the book, and this is where he starts to define beingness. So he starts defining, or rather he defines beingness as this elemental essence, which is almost self-fulfilling, right? So you don't need to do anything. There's nothing to be achieved or no path to take towards beingness, because it is essential. It is an essential quality that you have. And how when we make the transition from being a newly born baby that has no self, when we make the transition towards ego, something in our beingness is a little bit cut off. So we can never lose our beingness, but we can become cut away from it. The way we become cut away from it is by identifying with our self-image and becoming trapped in a web of object relations, which are kind of snapshots that we take of the world around us. So we become surrounded by these object relations. We identify with one of them, which is our sense of self. And through that sense of self, we interact with all the other object relations that we've created for ourselves, so that we are always at least one step away removed from being in contact with what is actually out there. There is a phenomenon in psychology called transference, in which we are always interacting with the world through the snapshots that we have taken about what things are in the past. So this forms a very thick veil through which we see reality, and so that we are never actually in touch with reality. Almaas makes a very important point, which is that no matter how refined our object relations become, no matter how accurate they are in reflecting what is actually there, it is still a reflection, and it is still falling far short of us becoming directly in contact with what is. And therefore, this is where already we start to make a big separation between spirituality and at least traditional psychology. And the traditional psychology sees it as our job to refine our object relations as well as possible, make them as pliable and accurate as we can, and never really to get rid of the object relation or see through the object relation of the self-image, but rather to make it as accurate as possible. Whereas in spirituality, we want to see through all object relations, regardless of how accurate they are, because we want to eventually come fully into touch with our actual beingness, which was there before our sense of self, our psychological sense of self arose. So it is prior to that. There is another very important point, which is the title that I'm using for this video. And it is something that is, it's a very strong statement from Almaas. And it comes from the idea that as the ego forms, its formation is a kind of defense mechanism that is created in order to deal with the apparent otherness of reality. So if you remember in our last video, we mentioned that the ego is born by a split that takes place in our psyche when we go from being a single bubble of perception to splitting into subject and object, with the object typically being mother and the subject being the object of our sense of self. When that split happens, everything that happens after that is an attempt to protect that sense of self, which is the egoic sense of self. Because the egoic sense of self has no being of its own, being simply a mental object, it always feels lack. It always feels the need to do, obtain, avoid, defend, acquire, in order to prop up its lack of beingness. And I've mentioned in the past that if this sounds like the ego is looking for narcissistic supply, is because it is. The ego, the spurious sense of self, is just a mental object. It lacks beingness and therefore is always in a constant seeking of validation. And so Almaas says it in very plain words. He says it is clear that ego in its very nature is narcissistic. So that no matter how well adapted we are, no matter how healthy an ego we have developed, there is a fundamental sense of lack hiding and always lurking behind our egoic identification. Our identification with our self-image or the object of the self, as opposed to the pure beingness that was there before these object relations and the sense of self formed in our mind. And this goes once again to undermine, or rather to underpin, what we expressed about autonomy, in that the autonomy of the ego gives us the ability to be effective in the world, to do things, to separate, individuate away from mother. It has a value, and yet the moment we have that autonomy granted by the ego, we immediately become ensnared by the lack of fundamental autonomy that the ego creates, because the ego creates autonomy on the level of doing, thinking, and feeling, but it undermines the autonomy, the essential autonomy of being what you are before you had a personality with which you identified. And this is absolutely crucial, of course, because in this third chapter, Almaas comes to define what he calls the personal essence, which is our ability to be directly in contact with our pure beingness, which he describes as a sensation of firmness, strength, smoothness, dense fluidity, flexibility. It is strong, well-developed, vibrant, robust, and sensuous. So all of these things we are cut away from to the degree that we are identified with the self-image. And that self-image creates, as I said, a fundamental sense of lack that is narcissistic at its core. Now, that is not to say that a well-formed ego keeps this narcissism at bay. It tempers it through good socialization, good emoting, being in contact with your beingness on the level of somatics. And yet, so long as the primary sense of self is identified with the self-image as opposed to beingness, there is a hunger that needs to be constantly appeased, and we will be always operating from ego and trying to do things on behalf of that ego that we believe ourselves to be. So that was the third installment in The Pearl Beyond Price, a fantastic book by A.H. Almaas. I'll try to keep doing these at least on a weekly basis. Very curious about your thoughts on this one, so share them in the comment section. And as usual, if you think that these videos are helpful to others, then your liking, sharing, and subscribing makes the channel more popular. It's very motivating to me, and I'll be back with more videos pretty soon. Until then, cheerio. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.